Hello everyone, this is the Silent King, and I can hold my silence no longer. Today I'd like to read you one of my favorite stories, a Warhammer novel called Skavenslayer, Gotrek and Felix, Book Number 2, by William King. This is a dark age, a bloody age, an age of demons and sorcery. It is an age of battle and death, and of the world's ending. Amidst all the fire, flame, and fury, it is a time, too, of mighty heroes, and of bold deeds and great courage. At the heart of the old world sprawls the Empire, the largest and most powerful of the human realms, known for its engineers, sorcerers, traders, and soldiers. It is a land of great mountains, mighty rivers, dark forests, and vast cities. And from his throne in Altdorf reigns the Emperor Karl Franz, sacred descendant of the founder of these lands, Sigmar, and wielder of his magical warhammer. But these are far from civilized times. Across the length and breadth of the old world, from the knightly palaces of Bretonnia to icebound Kislev in the far north, come rumblings of war. In the towering World's Edge Mountains, the orc tribes are gathering for another assault. Bandits and renegades harry the wild southern lands of the border princes. There are rumors of rat things, the Skaven, emerging from the sewers and swamps across the land, and from the northern wilderness there is the ever-present threat of chaos, of demons and beastmen corrupted by the foul powers of the dark gods. As the time of battle draws ever near, the Empire needs heroes like never before. Skaven's Claw. I would like to forget the long, hard trudge through the winter woods, which followed our encounter with the children of Ulrich, and it pains me to this day to think of the punishment we meted out to the girl Medgalana. But my companion was unrelenting, and no evil we encountered was ever spared, if that could be avoided. In this case, it could not be. With heavy hearts, we entered the forest once more and set off northwards. At long last, we found ourselves in the great elector city of Nuln, a place of refinement, sophistication, wealth, and great learning, and a city in which my family had long had business dealings. At that time, the Countess Emmanuelle, at the height of her fame, power, and beauty, and her city attracted the wealthy, the aristocratic, and the famous like a candle flame attracts moths. Nuln was one of the most beautiful cities in all the Empire. Of course, our own entry into the life of the city was made at a level far lower on the social scale. Short of cash, hungry and weary from our long journey, we were forced to take employment in what was possibly the very worst occupation we were to pursue in our long wanderings. And during that period, we encountered a fiend to bedevil our paths for long years to come. An excerpt from My Travels with Gotrek, Volume 3, by Her Felix Jaeger, Altdorf Press, 2505. Chapter 1. Stuck in a sewer, hunting goblins. What a life, Felix Jaeger muttered with feeling. He cursed all the gods roundly. In his time, he had come to consider himself something of an expert of unprepossessing surroundings. But this must surely take the prize. 20 feet overhead, the population of the city of Nuln went about its lawful daily business. And here he was, in the dark, creeping along narrow walkways where a single slip could put him over his head in a reeking foulness. His back ached from stooping for hours on end. Truly, in all his long association with the troll slayer, Gotrek Gurnison, he had never before plumbed to such depths. "Stop moaning, manling! It's a job, isn't it?" Gotrek said cheerfully, paying not the slightest heed to the smell or the narrowness of the ledge, or the closeness of the bubbling broth of excrement the sewerjacks called the stew. The slayer looked right at home in the endless maze of brickwork and channels. Gotrek's squat, muscular form was far better adapted to the work than Felix's own. The dwarf picked his way along the ledges as sure-footed as a cat, In the 2 weeks they had been a part of the sewer watch, Gotrek had become far more adroit at the job than 10-year veterans of service. But then he was a dwarf. His people were reared in the lightless places far beneath the old world. It probably helped that he could see in the dark, Felix thought, and did not have to depend on the flickering light of the watchman's lanterns. That still did not explain how he endured the stink. Felix doubted whether even the dwarf hold smelled quite so bad. The stench down here was exquisitely vile. His head swam from the fumes. The troll slayer looked peculiar without his usual weapon. Felix had come to think of the battle axe as being grafted into his hand. Now the dwarf had his huge star metal axe strapped across his back. There was not enough space to swing it in the most areas of the sewer. Felix had tried to get Gotrek to leave the weapon in the watch armory alongside his own magical sword, but had failed. Not even the prospect of its own weight dragging him below the sewage if he fell in could cause the slayer to part with his beloved heirloom. So Gotrek carried a throwing hatchet in his right hand and a huge military pick in the other. Felix shuddered when he imagined the latter being used. It resembled a large hammer with a cruel hooked spike on one side. Driven by the dwarf's awesome strength, he did not doubt that it could shatter bone and tear through muscle with ease. Felix tightened his grip on his own short stabbing sword, wished that he still carried the Templar Aldred's dragon-hilted mage blade with him. The prospect of facing goblins in the dark made him long for the reassurance of using his familiar weapon. Perhaps Gotrek was right to keep his axe so close. His fellow sewerjacks were ominous, shadowy figures. They wore no uniforms save for the ubiquitous scarves wrapped around their heads, like Araby turbans, with long folds obscuring their mouths. Over the last 2 weeks, though, Felix had become familiar enough with them to recognize their silhouettes. There was a tall, spare Gant, whose scarf concealed a face turned into moonscape by pockmarks and whose neck was a volcanic archipelago of erupting boils. If ever there was a good advertisement for not staying a sewerjack for 20 years, Gaunt was it. The thought of his toothless smile, bad breath, and worse jokes made Felix want to cringe. Not that he had ever pointed this out to Gaunt's face. The sergeant had hinted that he had killed many a man for it. There was the squat, ape-like giant Rudy, with his massive barrel chest and hands almost as big as Gotrek's. He and the troll slayer often arm-wrestled in the tavern after work. Despite straining until the sweat ran down his bald pate, Rudy had never beaten the dwarf, although he had come closer than any man Felix had ever seen. Then there were Hef and Spider, the new boys as Gaunt liked to call them, because they had only been with the sewerjack for 7 years. They were identical twins who lived with the same woman on the surface, and who had the habit of finishing each other's sentences. So strange were their long, lantern-jawed faces and their fish-like staring eyes that Felix suspected inbreeding or mutation was part of their heritage. He did not doubt their deadliness to hand-to-hand combat, though, or their dedication to each other and their girl, Gilda. He had seen them do terrible things with their long, hooked-bladed knives to a pimp who had actually insulted her one night. Along with the burly, one-eyed dwarf, these were the men he worked with, as disparate a crew as he had ever known. They were vicious men who couldn't find work that suited them anywhere else, and who had finally found an employer who asked no questions. There were times when Felix felt like going along to the office of his father's company and begging for money so he could leave this place. He knew they would give it to him, too. He was still the son of Gustav Jaeger, one of the Empire's wealthiest merchants. He also knew that word of his capitulation would get back to his family. They would know he had come crawling back to them, after all his fine boasts. They would know he had taken the money he had affected to so despise. Of course, it had been easy to despise money on the day he had stormed from his house, because he had never known the lack of it. His father's threat to disown him was meaningless because he simply had not understood it. He had grown up rich. The poor were a different species, Sad, sickly things. Things that begged on the street corners and that obstructed the path of one's coach. He had learned since that day. He had endured hardship, and he thought he could take it. But this was very nearly the last straw. Being forced to become a sewer jack, the lowest of the low, amongst the hired bravos of Nuln, but there had simply been nothing else for it. Since their arrival, no one else would hire two such down-at-heel rogues as himself and Gotrek. It pained Felix to think of how he must have looked, seeking work in his tattered breeches and patched cloak. He had always been such a fine dresser. Now they needed the money. Any money. Their long trek through the land of the Border Princes had yielded no reward. They had found the lost treasure of Karak 8 Peaks, but they had left it to the ghosts of its owners. It had been a case of find work, steal, or starve, and both he and the Trollslayer were too proud to steal or beg. So here they were, in the sewers below the Empire's second greatest city, crawling beneath the seat of learning that Felix had once dreamed of attending, haunting slimy tunnels below the home of the Elector Countess Emmanuel, the most famous beauty of the nation. It was not to be borne. Felix wondered constantly what ill-omened star had marked his birth. He consoled himself with the thought that at least things were quiet. It might be dirty work, but so far it had not proved dangerous. "Tracks!" he heard Gaunt shout. "Ha ha! We found some of the little buggers! Prepare for action, lads!" "Good!" Gotrek rumbled. "Dang," Felix muttered. Even as inexperienced a sewer jack as Felix could spot these tracks. "Skaven!" Gotrek hawked and spat a huge glob of phlegm out into the main channel of the sewer. It glistened atop a patch of phosphorescent algae. "Ratmen, spawn of chaos!" Felix cursed. A job only 2 weeks, and already he was about to meet some of the creatures of the depths. He had almost been able to dismiss Gaunt's stories as simply the imaginings of a man who had nothing better with which to fill his long, tedious hours. Felix had long wondered if there really could be a whole demented subworld beneath the city as Gaunt had hinted. Were there colonies of outcast mutants who sought refuge in the warm darkness and crept out at night to raid the market for scraps? Could there actually be cellars where forbidden cults held ghastly rituals and offered up human sacrifices to the ruinous powers? Was it possible that immense rats which mocked the form of man really scuttled through the depths? Looking at these tracks, it suddenly seemed all too possible. Felix stood frozen for a moment, remembering Gotrek's tales of the Skaven and their continent-spanning webwork of tunnels. Gaunt tugged his sleeve. "Well, let's get on with it," the sergeant said. "We ain't got all day." "Never been here before," Hef whispered, his voice echoing way down the long stretch of corridor. "Never want to come here again," Spider added, rubbing the blue arachnid tattoo on his cheek. For once, Felix was forced to agree with them. Even by the standards of Nuln sewers, this was a dismal place. The walls had crumbled, rotten looked to them. The little gargoyles on the support arches had been blurred by age until their features were no longer visible. The stew bubbled in tiny wisps. The air was close, fetid, and hot. And there was something else. The place had an even more oppressive atmosphere than usual. The hair on the back of Felix's neck prickled, as it sometimes did when he sensed undercurrents of sorcery nearby. "Doesn't look safe," Rudy said, looking at the support arch dubiously. Gotrek's face twisted as if he were a personal insult. "Nonsense," he said. "These tunnels were dwarf-built 1,000 years ago. This is Khazalad workmanship. It'll last an eternity." To prove his point, he banged the arch of his fist. Perhaps it was just bad luck, but the gargoyle chose that moment to fall forward from its perch. The Slayer had to leap to one side to avoid being hit on the head, and narrowly avoided skidding into the stew. "Of course," Gotrek added, "some of the labor was done by human artisans. That gargoyle, for instance, typical shoddy manling workmanship." No one laughed. Only Felix dared even smile. Gaunt stared up at the ceiling. The lamp set down at his feet underlit his face, making him look eerie and demonic. "We must be below the old quarter," he said wistfully. Felix could see he was contemplating the district of palaces. A strange melancholy expression transfigured his gaunt, bony features. Felix wondered whether he was pondering the difference between his life and the gilded existence of those above, contemplating the splendors he would never know and the opportunities he would never have. Momentarily, he felt a certain sympathy for the man. "There must be a fortune up there," Gaunt said. "Wish I could climb up and get it." "Well, no sense in wasting time. Let's get on with it." "What was that?" Gotrek asked suddenly. The others looked round, startled. "What was what?" Hef asked. "And where was what?" asked Spider. "I heard something. Down that way." All their gazes followed the direction indicated by the troll slayer's pointing finger. "You're imagining things," Rudy said. "Dwarves don't imagine things." "Oh, Sarge, do we have to look into this?" Rudy whined. "I want to get home." Gaunt rubbed his left eye with the knuckles of his right fist. He seemed to be concentrating. Felix could see he was wavering. He wanted to leave and be off to the tavern just as quickly as the rest of them. But this was his responsibility. If something was wrong beneath the palaces and anyone found out that he had been there and done nothing about it, then it was his neck for the block. "We better look into it," he said eventually, ignoring the groans of his fellow sewerjacks. "It shouldn't take long. I'll lay odds it's nothing anyway." Knowing his luck, Felix decided that was a bet he wouldn't take. Water dripped down from the arch of the tunnel. Gaunt had narrowed the aperture of his lantern so that only the faintest glimmering of light was visible. From up ahead came the sound of voices. Even Felix could hear them now. One of the voices was human, with an aristocratic accent. It was impossible to believe that the other belonged to a man. It was high-pitched, eerie, and chittering. If a rat had been given the voice of a human being, it would have sounded like this. Gaunt stopped and turned to look back at his men, his face pale and worried. He obviously didn't want to go on. Glancing around the faces of his fellow sewerjacks, Felix knew they all felt the same. It was the end of the day. They were all tired and scared, and up ahead was something they didn't want to meet. But they were sewerjacks, men whose only virtue was courage, and the willingness to face what others would not, in a place where others would not go. They had a certain pride. Gotrek tossed the hatchet into the air. It spun upward, blade catching a little of the light. With no apparent effort, the trollslayer caught it by the haft as it fell. Spider pulled his long-bladed knife from its sheath and shrugged. Hef gave a feral smile. Rudy looked down at his short sword and nodded. Gaunt grinned. The trollslayer looked pleased. He was in the company of a sort of maniacs that he could understand. Gaunt gestured softly, and they shuffled forward, picking their way carefully and quietly along the slimy ledge. As they turned the bend, he opened up his lantern to illuminate their prey. "Your payment, a token of my esteem." "Something for your own personal use," Felix heard the aristocratic voice say. Two figures stood frozen like trolls in a fairy tale, petrified by the sudden bright light. One was a tall man, garbed in a long black robe like a monk's. His face was patrician, fine-boned, cold, and aloof. His black hair was cut short, ending in a widow's peak above his forehead. He was reaching forward to hand the other figure something that glowed eerily. Felix recognized it. He had seen the substance before in the abandoned dwarf fortress of Karak, 8 Peaks. It was a ball of warpstone. The recipient was short and inhuman. Its fur was gray, its eyes pink. Its long, hairless tail reminded Felix of a great worm. As the thing turned to peer at the sudden light, the thing's tail lashed. It reached inside its long patchwork robes and clutched something in its taloned paws. From its belt hung an unscabbarded, rusty, saw-toothed blade. "Skaven!" Gotrek roared. "Prepare to die!"
Foo-foo, you said you were not followed?
The thing chittered at its human companion.
You said no one knew.
Stay where you are, Gaunt said. Whoever you are, you're under arrest on suspicion of witchcraft, treason, and unnatural practices with animals. The sergeant's confidence had been restored by the fact that there were only 2 of them. Even the fact that one of the perpetrators was a monster seemed to leave him undaunted. Hef, Spider, take them and bind them. The rat thing suddenly threw the sphere it had withdrawn from its clothing.
Die, foolish man-things!
Hold your breath! Gotrek shouted, his hatchet hurtling forward simultaneously. The Skaven sphere tinkled and shattered like glass, and an unhealthy-looking green cloud billowed upward. As he shoved Felix back down the corridor, Gotrek grabbed Rudy and pulled him with him. From inside the gas cloud came the sound of a gurgling and choking. Felix felt his eyes begin to water. Everything went dark as the lantern went out. It was like being caught in a nightmare. He couldn't see, he was afraid to take a breath. He was stuck in a narrow corridor underground, and somewhere out there was a monster armed with deadly, incomprehensible weapons. Felix felt the slick slime of the stone under his hands. As he fumbled, he suddenly felt nothing. His hand was over the stew. He felt unbalanced and afraid to move, as if he could suddenly topple in any direction and plunge into the sewage. He closed his eyes to keep them from stinging and forced himself to move on. His heart pounded, his lungs felt as though they were about to burst. The flesh between his shoulder blades crawled. He expected the sawtooth blade to be plunged into his back at any moment. He could hear someone trying to scream behind him and failing. They gurgled and gasped, and their breathing sounded terribly labored, as if their lungs were filling with a fluid. It was the gas, Felix realized. Gotrek had told him of the foul weapons which the Skaven used, the products of a chaos-inspired alchemy, allied to a warped and inhuman imagination. He knew that to take one breath of that foul-smelling air was to die. He also knew that he could not keep from breathing indefinitely. Think, he told himself. Find a place where the air was clear. Keep moving. Get away from the killing cloud. Don't panic. Don't think about the huge, rat-like shape creeping ever closer in the dark with its blade bared. As long as you keep calm, you'll be safe. Slowly, inch by torturous inch. Inch by torturous inch. His lungs screaming for air, he forced himself to crawl towards safety. Then the weight fell on him. Silver stars flickered before his eyes, and all the air was driven straight from his lungs. Before he could stop himself, he took in a mouthful of foul air. He lay in the dark, gasping, and slowly it dawned on him. He wasn't dead. He wasn't choking. No knife had been driven to his back. He forced himself to try and move. He couldn't. It was as if a great weight lay across him. Terror flashed through his mind. Maybe his back was broken. Maybe he was a cripple. "Is that you, Felix?" he heard Rudy whisper. Felix almost laughed with relief. His burden was his huge fellow sewer jack. "Yes, where are the others?" "I'm all right," he heard Hef say. "Me too, brother." That was Spider. "Gotrek, where are you?" "Gotrek, where are you?" No answer. Had the gas got him? It seemed impossible. The Trollslayer couldn't be dead. Nothing as insidious as gas could have killed him. It wouldn't be fair. "Where's the Sarge? Anybody got some light?" Flint sparked. A lantern flickered to life. Felix saw that something large was shuffling towards them along the shadows of the ledge. Instinctively, his hand reached for his sword. It wasn't there. He had dropped it when he fell. The others stood poised and waiting. "It's me," said the Trollslayer. "Bloody human got away. His legs were longer." "Where's Gaunt?" Felix asked. "Look for yourself, manling." Felix squeezed past and went to do so. The gas had vanished as quickly as it appeared, but it had done its work on Sergeant Gaunt. He lay in a pool of blood. His eyes were wide and staring. Trickles of red emerged from his nostrils and mouth. Felix checked the body. It was already cooling, and there was no pulse. There was no wound on the corpse. How did he die, Gotrek? Felix knew about magic, but the fact that a man could be killed and have no mark left on him made his mind reel. He drowned, manling. He drowned in his own blood. The Slayer's voice was cold and furious. Was that how he dealt with fear, Felix wondered? By turning it into anger? Only after the dwarf went over and started kicking the corpse did he notice the dead Skaven. Its skull had been split by the thrown hatchet.